Hey everyone, my name is Kelvin. I'm a developer and I make free tutorial content. If you like this kind of thing, consider subscribing and liking the video. And if you want to support me in other ways, you're always welcome to buy me a coffee. Hey, so today I want to build something like purely front end, just so we can focus on Reagent and how to use that. I think I want to make a calorie calculator so that you calculate your BMR. And the first step is that we're going to initialize a node project, as well as create a shadow-cljs.even file. And before we open this up, let's also install shadow-cljs, and now we can set up the project. As always, shadow-cljs is a Clojure map, and we'll just need to define certain properties. Let's add our source directories. Here I'm just saying that all of our source code is going to live in the directory called src. And let's also have our dependencies. Right now I think all we need is the dev tools, as well as the reagent libraries. I'm not sure if we need anything else, but we'll add them as we need them. And then finally, let's just add our configuration for our application. So here I'm saying that we're going to be using port 9000 for our nREPL, where our front-end application is going to be on port 3000, and we're going to be using all the assets from resources/public. And then finally, our app.core namespace will have the functions init and reload. And then finally, just to finish the setup, we'll need to create these two directories, or file directories: source app core.cljs, as well as resources public index.html. And just to fill in the index.html file, we have a very normal boilerplate here. The things to note here is that we're going to have a CSS file link, as well as a script tag for our main.js. Both of these are going to be dynamically created, and we're going to set those up in a bit. And then for our core.cljs, I have just console log code here, but I just wanted to make sure that we define both load or reload and init. And now let's use npm to install tailwindcss so that we could dynamically create the CSS file. You will also need npm run all, just for convenience. Next, we'll just initialize tailwind.css. That'll create a config file, which looks something like this, but we will need to change the content because by default, Tailwind expects us to be using JavaScript, but we're using Clojurescript. So it'll look something like this. Basically, it's going to be reading all of the files within source. That's either HTML, CSS, Clojure, or Clojurescript. And then in package.json, we'll need to add a watch CSS script here, where it will read from index.css from our app directory, or our source directory. We're going to need to make that file, and that'll be at the root of our source directory. And all we really need is the base components from Tailwind. So that's base, components, and utilities here. Let's go back to our package.json, and I want to add another script here for watching our Clojurescript files. And finally, the script that we'll be running is dev, which is where npm run all comes in handy. So we're going to be running both of these scripts in parallel. That's what the -p is for. And with that, all of our setup should be done. I believe we can get started on coding the application now. Alright, let's just write a simple hello world so that we can see this in action. So first I'm going to write an app function that just returns the hiccup form of hello world inside of a div. And then inside of the reload function, we just need to call reagent dom/render, where we provide app inside of a vector. And then we need to call get element by ID, targeting the div of app. If you don't know where this is coming from, in index.html is referring to this application div here. Okay, with all of that done, let's call npm run dev to build this. And once the build's completed, you'll notice that the CSS and the JavaScript code has been dynamically created. We also run this, or we can also open this up in a browser, and all we really need to see is the hello world that's being rendered. I also want to open up the inspector so that you can see the console logs that are being printed out. So application starting and reloaded is working correctly. I think what I want to do now is to move app into its own file. This is a pretty dumb namespace, but it's going to be app.app. And then in core, we can add this require statement and remove the redundant app function here. Back in the app namespace, we could create a state atom, and this will be where we'll have all of our application state. We're using def once here just because if we have the REPL running, we don't want it to reinitialize every time. And then for the bulk of our code, I'm going to make a new namespace called components. And let's start with an input form. So far we just have a form and a button to submit. Let's make sure that we add the onSubmit prop so that we prevent default of the event. This way the form won't submit to a server because we don't have a server here. Let's also pass in the state so we can manipulate the form values inside of the state of our application. Next we'll add radio buttons for our units, because one of them is going to be for imperial units, so pounds and feet and inches, and the other one being for metric units. And of course we'll also need radio buttons for male or female gender. and we'll have number inputs for age and weight. So let's wire up the state so then we can actually manipulate some values. After thinking about it, I want the shape of the state so that all the form values are going to be inside of its own object, but I also want units to have its own properties so that it's easier to access. Alright, with the shape of the state kind of done, let's surround the form in a let binding. That way we could destructure these properties. Let's update the props for the age and weight input first because it's the most straightforward. So for both of these inputs, the value is coming from the form property or the form map. And then for onChange, we're gonna swap the property inside of form age. So this is the path to this specific value. And we'll do the same thing for weight. Now onto the radio buttons. We can add here the value and the checked properties. And the onChange is pretty similar to the text inputs, except here we're explicitly saying the value here instead of using the event. And then similarly for the units, we're doing imperial and metric the same way. Now because the units is outside of the form state, I actually want to reset the entire form state when these change. So we're going to extend the anonymous function here for the onChange into a do, so then we could do multiple function calls at the same time. And all I want to do here is just to swap the form state to be an empty map. And we'll need to update the metric version of the radio button as well. Alright, next let's create our dynamic height. So I created two functions, one for imperial height and one for metric height inputs. Both of them are going to take in the state, and we'll be able to destructure form from that state. The metric one is going to be pretty simple. We're just using centimeters, and I decided that the value inside the form will just be the unit number. The onChange method is identical to the other text input, or the number inputs, I mean. And we'll do the same thing for the imperial input. The big difference here is that there's two inputs now, one for the feet and one for the inches. Now that both of those inputs are created, let's go back to our form, and let's go to the bottom here. We're going to add back in the label for height, and then we'll use the if statement to determine which input that we'll need. We're just triggering off of the equality of units, and if it's imperial, then we'll render the imperial one, and if not, then we'll render the metric. I believe that's everything for the form. Let's just go all the way up. Extend the onSubmit, just so that we can console log the form state. And then finally in app.app, require the calculator form, and make sure that we call it with our state, and now we can take it for a spin. Okay, so remember to call npm run dev if you haven't already, and it'll look something a little like this. So I know it doesn't look pretty right now, we're just testing the UI functionality. So changing the units, what the hell? So let's press submit, and we get null, which is not good. Okay, so I know what I did wrong. In all of these let bindings, I'm not dereferencing the state, so we're actually interacting with the atom itself and not the value inside of the atom. So to fix that, let's make sure that we add the @sign to dereference the state in each of the let bindings, and the most important one is the one inside of the calculator form. Okay, let's go back to the browser. Alright, that's a little better. The units is already predefined, and that's because we set it inside the state. And if we change the units, we should see these two inputs on height change, and it goes to centimeters. Alright, let's just quickly fill this in, and we press submit, the correct state should be outputted. And if you don't see the map formatted this way, we are using binary age for the DevTools, and that requires you to use enable custom formatters, which is this setting here inside of the DevTools. And now let's try it in the metric. Okay, so now that we know the form works, let's actually do the calculations. And calculating the calories and the BMR, I'm getting it from this website, and I'll have it linked below. The formula that we need for women is going to be this for the BMR, and for men it'll be this one. And here we have modifiers for the lifestyle activity, or activity lifestyle for each person. So now we're going to make a new file called conversion, and we're going to make the two BMR functions that takes in weight, height, and age. But because these two functions require the units to be in metric, we need to make conversion functions to change the imperial values into metric. So that'll take the number in inches and turn it into centimeters, as well as the number in pounds and turns it into kilograms. And then finally for our metric, or our imperial version of height is in feet and inches, we also need a conversion from feet to inches. Now we can make the function for calculating the results. And here we'll need to know the form state as well as the units that we're in. So far I just destructured age, weight, and gender from the form, and then added a conditional over here so that we know which BMR formula that we're going to take based on the gender. Next, inside the let binding, we're going to determine the weight, and if it's in imperial, we'll do the conversion. If not, we'll just send the actual weight. And then for height, we'll do the same thing, except in the imperial, we need to convert the feet to inches, and then add that with the existing inches. Alright, with all of that, we can go back to our components, make sure that we require the calculate result function that we just created, and then inside of the form onSubmit function, we'll calculate the result, and then we'll add it into the state. I think all we need to do now is to style the application. Let's go into the app namespace, and add some tailwind classes here. So I decided to surround this div with the main so that we can have the card look where the card's in the middle and the background is just a gray screen. So to do that, we'll just use these classes. Flex, justify center, and item center. We'll just put this div in the very middle. We'll set the minimum height to the screen and the background just to be the gray 200 color. And to make this responsive, we'll add the small prefix to both the background and the flex so that it effectively doesn't mean anything. And then the inside card on mobile browsers, it'll be full, but then once it gets a certain size, it'll be width of 2/3. MX auto to center it, and then we'll just add padding to the entire card. Also on larger screens, I do want to add the rounded corners because I think it looks nice. Now inside of components, we have a lot of text inputs and I want all of them to look the same. So I'll make a def here just for the singular string and then we can use it everywhere else. So here, nothing too crazy. Shadow border just to make it look nice. And of course, because it's the input, I want it to be width full with some padding, and I'm also adding margin bottom here just to give it some more spacing. And then for the outline, I'm going to go with indigo blue, and that will be the theme of this little card here. Now with that, let's add this text input class to all of our inputs. We'll start by adding them to all of the height inputs. The imperial one is going to be a little different in that we want it on the same line, so I'm going to do flex justify between for the container div. And then for the second one, I'm also going to add margin left of 4 just so there's a small separation. And I'm using the string constructor class thing, so make sure that there's a space here just so the classes don't kind of get squished together. And then finally down here, let's make sure that we add it to the age and weight as well. Alright, so this is what it looks like so far. Let's do the submit button now. Let's go ahead and start with these classes. All of these are pretty simple, it's just spacing and then rounded and shadow just to give it a little bit of extra look. And now I'm also adding the background, hover, and text white, and bold to make it pop out a little bit more. And then I'll put this all in one line, but this is just so that you can see it better. Now radio buttons are going to be not too tricky, it's just going to be a little complicated if you don't follow the parens. So for each radio button, I'm going to surround it by a div because we want to give it a specific label for that value. So for this one, it's going to be imperial, and I'm going to do the same thing for the next input. Now for the radio group, I'm going to surround it by another div like this, and same for formatting. And both of these divs are going to have some flexbox classes. The radio groups will be justify round, and each radio button and label will be justify or item center. Up at the top, I'm also going to make a new def here for the radio, which is nothing too crazy. I'm adding a color to it, and I'm also going to change the size of the radio buttons so that it's a little bigger. And we'll add this to all of the radio buttons. Here it is on the units. I forgot to add the item center to the second little radio and checkbox, or radio and label. So we'll do that. And now we'll do the same thing for gender. And just because I want this on video, this is the before, and here's the after. We basically did the same thing. We added the flex, as well as the radio button class, and then the label for male and female. And I got rid of my face so you can actually see the button. Okay, with all of that, let's do a quick test. And these are my actual stuff, but oh right, we didn't add the results. We should start doing that. Okay, let's make the results card function at the very bottom of components. I believe in our form submission, we saved it into the results property of state, so let's destructure that there. And we'll put this inside a win. This way this component will only be rendered when the results exist. Okay, I think I misspelled it, so it's just results. And finally, we need to require this in app, and we do that by adding it to the refer vector here, and then we'll add it in the bottom of app, the app component. Okay, so this is not the expected results. I'm going to do a little bit of debugging. So it turns out in conversion, inches is a string here because it's being passed through by the input. So to fix that, I'm just going to change it to a number by doing int. If we press submit again, we'll get a more accurate calorie number. Now let's go back to components, and there is one thing I want to do, which is to call math.floor or math/floor, so that we get rid of all the decimal points or all the numbers after the decimal point. And of course, let's add some styles. I'm just going to give it some margin top. And then finally for the H2 where we're showing the BMR, I also want to make the text bigger, center, and give it some color. Now we're not complete because I do want to take into account the activity factor. So in conversion, I'm going to add a new def at the very bottom called activity factor, and it's just going to be a map of all the different factors that we need to multiply the BMR with. So we have sedentary, light, moderate, very active, and extreme active. Now with this def, we could add it to the very top, require it in from app.conversion, and we can call it down here to display underneath the result BMR. Also, before I did that, I'm gonna also add another paragraph here, just as a subtitle. And then for each property, I'm gonna create a div here with 2 paragraphs. One for the name of the activity factor, and the other is flooring the result multiplied by the factor. And of course, let's just add flex justify between to make it a little bit nicer to see. And here it is with all the factors. So our calculator is complete, and based on my age, height, and width, it looks like my BMR is about 1800, so this is how much I should be eating every day. Alright, so I hope you learned a little bit about Reagent. At the very least made a little application that is kind of nice to use. Hopefully it'll also be a little health conscious so that you know where you're standing. And with that, I guess I'll see all of you next time. If you like this kind of thing, consider subscribing and liking the video. And if you want to support me in other ways, you're always welcome to buy me a coffee.